So we have a really exciting beginning to our day today from World Wildlife Fund. And I get to invite Jason Clay to come speak. If you guys haven't seen his TED Talk, it's really incredible. Actually, after this, I want to send you a lot of TED Talks that are incredible from our speakers because they've all rocked my world, and I'm sure it would be great for you to hear from them for the rest of the year as well. So, Jason is Senior Vice President for Food and Markets at World Wildlife Fund, and also launched the Markets Institute to identify and address global issues and trends in more timely, cost-effective ways. Over the course of his career, he has worked on a family farm and in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He has taught at Harvard and Yale and spent 15 years with human rights NGOs working with indigenous people, refugees, and famine victims. In 1988, he invented rainforest marketing, created one of the first U.S. fair trade eco-labels, and set up a trading company within the NGO. He was responsible for co-creating Rainforest Crunch and more than 200 other products with sales of $100 million. From 1999 to 2003, he co-directed a consortium with WWF, the World Bank, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, and the National Aquatic Centers of Asia Pacific to identify the most significant environmental and social impacts of shrimp aquaculture and management practices that measurably reduce them. Since then, he has co-convened multi-stakeholder roundtables of producers, investors, buyers, researchers, and NGOs to identify and reduce the impacts of salmon, soy, sugarcane, cotton, and beef. In the past, Clay has launched aquaculture, agricultural, and market transformation programs within the WWF network. Most recently, brought attention to the global issues such as illegality, degraded land, and long-term contracts as a way to use the market to change it. He is the author of 20 books and is the National Geographic's first ever Food and Sustainability Fellow. He was awarded the 2012 James Beard Award for his work on global food sustainability. Clay studied at Harvard University and the London School of Economics. Jason. Welcome.
So, I spent most of my life in various learning curves, and what I've found is that I talk to people that don't talk to each other, and I connect the dots. I can't remember names, but I remember facts and figures. And what I think I do, and a lot of other people do, including many in this room, we're trying to make change happen faster. We're not entrepreneurs. I mean, I'm not here to solve a business problem. I'm here to solve many business problems. I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm not changing a company from within, although I do that within my own organization. But I'm a person that's trying to be a pollinator that goes around and talks to different companies and leaves information behind from what I hear from others. I call this role the extrapreneur. And we need more extrapreneurs now than we ever have. And here, I think, is why. The Oromo in Ethiopia, when I was doing human rights work, have a saying, you can't wake a person who's pretending to sleep. And we're fundamentally pretending to sleep in the 21st century. We're not operating at the speed and scale of change. So, between when we identify an issue and when we actually begin to have on-the-ground results to address it, it's 30, 40, 50 years now. We started looking at rainforest. I helped create Rainforest Action Network in 1985. We got the first commitments from companies about deforestation-free products in 2010. Their commitments to deliver those products is 2020. That's already 35 years. And that's only 15% of the market. That's not the Chinese companies and the Indian companies and the other companies that are going to actually drive those markets. So we're operating at a speed and scale that nobody's taking really to heart. And I think none of the institutions we have today are up to the task. Not us individually, not companies, not NGOs, not governments. I would say companies are probably doing better than any of the rest. Governments are doing the worst. Governments not even managing their piece of the planet, much less the whole planet. companies are at least thinking about supply chains and beginning to think about how it fits together from their own perspective. Granted, that's fine. Got to start someplace. So the question is, how do we identify new issues and trends? How do we build awareness? How do we create consensus, and then strategic focus, and then field test and pilot and prototype, and then go to scale? If we can take that from 40 years to 20, we can double the results with a quarter the cost. And then if we can go from 20 to 10 because we get better at learning, then we can start actually beginning to act at the speed of life on the planet today. Maybe this isn't set up. So here's the challenge. Here's a, let's say, the next 40-year challenge. We have to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000 years. Now, if it's business as usual, that means we basically have to double food production. We actually need about 60 to 70% more food, but we waste a third. So if you take that into account, it means we basically have to double food production. Well, guess what? Food production is already the biggest human impact on the planet. There's no other human activity that's bigger than food production. Here's just a few of the things. It's driven 70% of biodiversity to extinction. It's 25 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. Arguably the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions, all in. Land use change, inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, etc., volatilization of carbon from the soil, all those different things, methane from animals and rice. We use more chemicals on agriculture than any other human activity. 85% of our fish stocks are fished at or beyond capacity globally. 70% of all the fresh water that's used by people is used for agriculture globally. And about 50% of our topsoil has been lost in the last 150 years. So topsoil's kind of like the bank for agriculture. And there were a lot of comments yesterday about soil health and soil carbon and organic matter. All those are true, and all those are going in the wrong direction. So what are some of the other impacts? Well, in the last 25 years or so, 100 countries have taken land out of protection. They've either downgraded it or eliminated national parks and protected areas. They've done it to get access to resources, to get access to land to use to produce food, more than any other single thing. And it's not just land that's been affected. This is how the mammal biomass on the planet has changed. It's cattle, followed by people, followed by sheep, goats, pigs, horses, and even pets. If you look, each of these dots is 1 million metric tons. If you look at the little green dot in the bottom, that's all the elephant biomass on the planet. And that's actually half that size now because this slide is from data that's 10 years old, and there's half as many elephants as there were. All the wild mammals represent less than 3% of the biomass of biodiversity. That's how we've changed the distribution of animals on the planet. That's actually why I'm here to talk to you today. This is what we care about. This is our bread and butter. If we don't get where we produce food and how we produce food right, we can turn out the light and go home. From our point of view, we don't have a planet with biodiversity. We don't have a planet with ecosystem functions that are serving us with the water and the air and the other things we need. So, how is this happening? Why is this happening? I think China illustrates this case better than any. It took Britain 155 years to double the GDP of 9 million people. It took the US 53 years to double the GDP of 10 million people. It took China 12 years to double the GDP of 1 billion people. It took India 17 years to double the GDP of 822 million. That is the speed and scale of change today. Is that a bad thing? Absolutely not. That's what government should be trying to do, is doubling the GDP of people, increasing welfare, getting people out of poverty. China lifted 400 million people out of poverty in 12 years. That's amazing. No other government has ever done that in human history. But it has consequences that we're not anticipating. And we need to start getting ahead of the curve, not trying to play catch up. Just one little thing here. When China doubled the GDP, that ended in '95. It took 10 years for that to hit global commodity markets because people didn't trust the system. China bought 40% of the world's gold during that period, and they saved their money. And then they started buying meat, animal protein, things like that. And that's when you start seeing this. You start getting commodity price spikes starting in about 2006. These yellow dots, 23 countries where there were food riots and people were killed. This spawned the the Arab Spring, but there's no reason to think that we won't have an African fall or an African winter or a subcontinent spring. So what's going on here? Well, visually, let's say we have 7 billion people, and on average, they consume 1 unit's worth of consumption each year. So we got 7 billion units of consumption. Our data shows that those 7 billion units of consumption are already a little bit beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. That we use the planet's carrying capacity by August, and the rest we're living off the principal, not the interest. By 2050, we're going to have at least 9 billion, so let's just say 9 billion. They're going to have 2.9 times as much income because the China model is actually moving to other places in the world. They're going to consume more, and they're going to start with food because it's the cheapest thing to start with. So they're going to consume 18 billion units of consumption. So it's not just from 7 to 14, it's 7 to 18. If we're going to make all of that fit on the planet we've got, we're going to have to shrink how each unit of that is being consumed, how many resources it takes, how much land, how much water, how much fertilizer, how much pesticides. We're going to have to shrink it by 70% to make it fit. So just to tread water between now and 2050, everybody's got to become 70% more efficient. Think about what that means for you and your business. So we got to freeze the footprint of food. We got to do more with less. And the issue isn't what to think. There's no silver bullet. What works today won't work tomorrow because we've got to be having continuous improvement from now on. So it's going to be about change, not just one change, it's just about continuous change. The issue isn't what to think, it's how to think. What I think, from what I've talked to, what I hear, from what I have run the numbers and what I see, we can produce this amount of food by 2050, and we can do it with the same amount of land or less, the same amount of water or less. But we can't do it with a single strategy, and we can't probably do it with a single production system. Every production system's got to get better. And we've got to focus on productivity and efficiency on the one hand, and we've got to focus on reducing waste and shifting consumption on the other. Because we're going to get gains in each of these areas, different gains in different countries, but that's going to be how we get there. So let me just ask a question. On a finite planet, should consumers have a choice about sustainable products? Or should all the products on the shelf be sustainable? And if all the products on the shelf are sustainable, it means it's a whole different strategy to get there. It means you, in companies, have to be the ones that are making the decisions. A consumer spends 2.4 seconds in the US, like 3.8 seconds in Europe to make a decision. It doesn't matter whether you put the product list on the front of the bag or on the back of the bag. You cannot read and then understand the implications of what those products are, where they were produced, what the impacts were, et cetera. We need companies to start helping here. Consumers need to be informed, absolutely. But I think the biggest role for consumers on a finite planet with limited resources is going to be around the political implications of choice. That's why we have to bring consumers along as well, not just to make them informed about the actual food that they're buying for themselves or their pets. So waste. We waste 1 out of every 3 calories today. So if you look at it this way, this is waste. If we have to produce this much by 2050, waste is half of the new food that we need to produce, right? This is the 2/3 that we consume of what we produce. This is the waste, and this is the new part. Waste is the biggest single strategy to get us to 2050. It's the lowest hanging fruit of all. We're not going to eliminate waste, but can we cut it in half? And can we do it quickly as the start for how we get moving? Here's why waste is so important, though. Because of those other statistics I gave you earlier, if food and agriculture are 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, then food waste is 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions. The best greenhouse gas strategy we can have, the best climate strategy, is to eliminate food waste. No other thing is going to get us there that fast. If food uses 70% of all the water used by humans, then food waste uses 23%. The best freshwater strategy we can have on the planet is to reduce food waste. I'm not used to this thing, sorry. I've got this, I've got this. So, food waste, good strategy. Think about it in your own businesses. One of the biggest threats of food production is that we keep expanding into new habitats. Habitat conversion, whether it's grasslands in the US or tropical forest or other kinds of forest, it's the, I would call, agricultural sprawl, where we're not actually intensifying agriculture sustainably, but we're just extensifying it. We're just gobbling up the resources. So can we set a target of 250 million hectares that have been rehabilitated of degraded or abandoned land, where we had bad technology, we had bad management, we didn't understand how to do it better in the past. Today we've got better systems to do that. You heard about some yesterday. Can we move that forward more quickly? Today, it's not just that we use 70% of water, of all the water used by people to produce food, we use 1 liter per calorie produced. To get to where we need to be by 2050, we've got to be able to produce 2 calories with half a liter. That's the metric we need to start using. Can we get there? I spent much of my life trying to figure out, for those commodities that have the biggest impact on the planet, how can we reward the better producers? How can we set up certification programs, verification programs, standards that actually reward the best producers? And then I suddenly, after I've used this slide for like 5 years, it suddenly dawned on me, we're looking at this all wrong. If we reward the best producers, they're not the cause of the problem. The bottom 25% of every commodity that I've looked at, 20 or 30, produces 50% of the impacts and 10% of the product. The biggest productivity strategy we can have, the biggest environmental strategy we can have is to work with the bottom, not the top. Help the bottom get better. Continuous improvement. Move the bottom. Shift the curve. That's where we're starting to focus much more now. It's where you can also focus. Don't just go out and look for the best suppliers. Look for suppliers you can help get better. So there are also some challenges for animal protein. Let me just talk about the one form of animal protein production that has probably achieved over the last 80 years the types of efficiency that I'm saying every single commodity needs to achieve between now and 2050, and that's poultry. And it's done it by really focusing on 4 key metrics. So feed conversion, how many pounds of feed to how much pound of live weight, mortality rates and reducing those, age to market, time to market, and the weight at the time of market. And all of those things, either plus or minus, have been a kind of 1 in 3 factor, which is what we really need to have happen. But here's my question to you. These guys, up to 2005, they didn't include water in their calculation. They didn't include medicines in their calculations or any other chemicals, and they sure as hell didn't include animal welfare. If you throw any of those issues into this mix, it's not going to be business as usual. We're going to start seeing declines in productivity. And the biggest thing I think we're going to see with animal productivity is declines, not increases. Let me just point out one reason. There was a big study done by Michigan State and McDonald's and Cargill and some of the rest of us. And if you haven't read it, look at it. And it really looked at 3 commercial size operations for eggs. And I think each one laid 60 million eggs a year. And they ran one as a cage, one as a battery cage, and one as an open barn. And the one that performed the worst in every single instance was the open barn. Okay? So, and just one thing, the mortality rate increased by more than 3 times. Pecking order is real. It's not some kind of literary metaphor. It is real when it comes to things that descended from dinosaurs. Birds kill each other. That's going to happen if they're left to flock. They're going to establish a pecking order, and some are going to die. And that makes the whole system less efficient. So we have these values that we haven't quite figured out how to bring all together, because nobody is against animal welfare. But what does it actually look like on the ground? So I think we've got to stop from trying to maximize one variable to trying to figure out how to optimize several key ones at the same time. And that means that maybe none of them are going to be quite as good as we want, but with the package that we can live with, maybe. Then there's climate change and food production. Now, I know you don't feed dogs chocolate, but I think this is going to illustrate my point. This is where 70% of the world's chocolate is produced in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. This was in 2000. This is 13 years from now. That's how suitable that land is going to be to produce cocoa. So what we have is business as usual. That's this line. And there are a lot of us who are optimists. We believe in human ingenuity. We believe in technology. We think that all of those things are going to help us bend the curve. We're going to actually make that curve come around, and we can get to 2050. We can do it maybe a little longer than that, maybe a little better if we can get some more movement. But we're already seeing some key indicators that are not as good as we thought. But more importantly, with climate change, we're seeing that business as usual is actually something that we have to fight for, to even maintain, to tread water where we are today. And let me just use cocoa to illustrate that. If you look at these 8 indicators, from yields to illegal deforestation to the percentage of pods that come on a tree to the ones actually harvested, to poverty levels, to diseases, to carbon in the soil, the number of farmers that are being recruited into the system, if you look at every single one of those indicators, they're going in the wrong direction. Cocoa is broken. And this is one of the most high-valued consumer crops that is produced, and it's broken. I think a lot of commodities are broken today. We heard about beef yesterday. It's broken. How do we turn those systems around? We start measuring. We start managing what matters. We start moving those systems, but we do it with metrics. We do it with science. So I think we also do it by thinking differently and by using different platforms. So if we want to move sustainability and sustainability of our supplies, or even more sustainable, because whatever's sustainable today won't be tomorrow. Remember, we've got to get 70% more efficient. So we've got to be constantly getting better. One of the, and this is an odd industry. 17 companies produce 70% of the world's salmon. But what they found is that the reputation of the worst producer is the reputation of the whole industry. And so the best producers realize that if they want to have access to markets, license to operate, license to expand operations, they needed to help the worst ones get better. So they created a common database. They put all their information in it. They shared information on what their impacts were, what the investments were that it took to improve those impacts, what each of them could begin to do. That's been going 4 years now, and they've attacked big issues like sea lice and escapes and other kinds of issues, feed use and efficiency, feed formulation, etc. No other industry has done that yet. We've got to do more of this, because this is pre-competitive. What they realized was that all of the problems about sustainability were actually pre-competitive how they sold their product, what they sold, the price point, all the packaging, all that kind of stuff, where they sold it, that's all competitive. Whether they're allowed to even produce or not is pre-competitive. Ireland did the same thing. Ireland is the first country that said by 2016, and they didn't make it, we're going to guarantee that 100% of our food exports are certified as sustainable. They got about 80% of the way there with beef and dairy. 90% of their beef is exported, 70% of their dairy is exported. That's pretty big numbers for a country. No other country's done it. Okay, so we need to see more of that kind of thing, and we need to understand where the innovations are. Not that they're perfect. Ireland's not perfect, but it's better. And from it, we can all figure out how to become better. As they say, better is better. So the issue here is really risk. And it's both about availability of raw materials. That's what companies are worried about. But they're also worried about their reputations. So it's not just one or the other. And if you look at this S&P 500 market valuation, in 1975, companies were valued by what they owned, what material assets they had. By 2009, it had totally flipped. 81% was based on brand and reputation. Now, there's some IT and other things that they own in there too, but it's mostly brand value and reputation. That means they're much more interested in things like sustainability. One little thing that I've been working on, and that's getting a fair amount of underground attention lately, is illegality in food production. Let me just start with a headline. It appears that if you take the top 10 exporters of global food of any commodity, at least 50% of that commodity will be produced illegally, of every single export. That's what the data is now showing. Let me walk through how we got there. So we started hearing about this 5 years ago. I turned about 15 interns loose on that over the last 5 years. We've started getting a lot of data. The illegality falls into 5 categories. One is about resource access, resource rights, ownership, fisheries management systems, etc. One is about social issues and all the labor, etc. One is about other laws and regulations like the Forest Code in Brazil or other laws about pesticide use or prohibited pesticides, things like that. And then there's fraud and corruption. Half of the olive oil in the US is not olive oil. Go figure. And it's all along the value chain. But it's primarily and predominantly in the areas of production of the raw materials. That is where it's the most pervasive. So we did a little study. We talked to 6 or 8 of our corporate partners. We have partnerships with 70 of the 100 largest food companies in the world. And we started talking about this with them. So we got together traders from both Europe and the US, retailers and brands as well from both sides of the Atlantic. We figured out a study. We focused on 9 commodities on 8 geographies of origin. We only used data that's in the public domain. This was not going to be anything that was confidential or proprietary. We didn't name a single name in the study we did. And we found that for one country of origin, one commodity and one form of illegality only, and there's often 5 forms of illegality going on, just looking at one, every single instance showed that between 4 and 44% of the globally traded commodity was illegal. And the 44% was palm oil, because 70% of the concessions in Indonesia are illegal. So we drafted a white paper in September, presented it to the FMI, the GMA, and the Consumer Goods Forum. I'm assuming people know those acronyms, but maybe not. So here's the questions that come out of that study. If a product is produced illegally, can it ever be legal? Just because it changes hands, is it legal? Even if you bought it in good faith, does that make it legal? If a raw material is produced illegally, can it be used as an ingredient in a legal product? And here's maybe the one that's most important for you. If a feed ingredient is produced illegally, can it be used to produce animal protein that's legal? And this is where the dairy industry in the Netherlands got tripped up because of soy from Brazil. So how these systems all come together is a lot more complicated than people are thinking. Now, that was talk one. Now we're going to move to talk two. How much time do I have? Ooh, God. Okay. I want to just talk about some challenges and opportunities and some thoughts about sourcing strategies and kind of principles for the pet food industry. But let's start with one basic fact. As a company, what you touch is usually between 2 and 5 to 10% of the impacts of your entire value chain. So if you think you're going to focus and make a significant difference globally by what you can do yourself, you're wrong. You're like the drunk that's looking for the lost car keys under the street light because that's where the light's better. It's not because that's where the problem is or where the car keys are going to be found. So you got to think beyond. In fact, in the pet food industry, this left-hand side is where your biggest impacts are. Probably 50, 60, 70%, depending on the commodity. The right-hand side, if they require refrigeration after opening, you're going to have some issues there, that kind of thing. And you're going to have the end-of-life disposal of packaging, et cetera. You're also going to have people starting to compare the pet food industry and poverty. This is just on the web. This is just data that's on the web. There's another one that I used in a TED Talk that the average European cat uses as many resources in its lifetime as the average African. These are comparisons that anybody can make. The data is all there. And this is just land. If you want to take water, cats go way up because fish live in water. Think about it. The global demand for protein is getting more. You can see it's increasing. This is the projection by 2030, and it's not mostly coming from the US and Europe. It's coming from other places. And you're going to be competing with them. And you're going to be competing with them because much of what the pet food has been buying are choice products in other markets. And now with global trade, Brazil sells, its primary sale of poultry to China is, guess what? Chicken feet. That's what we're beginning to see. Necks have been used for a long time to make chicken tenders and those kinds of products. So the old saying within the animal protein world was that slaughterhouses break even selling meat and they make money selling the drop. And the drop is what the pet food industry traditionally bought, along with the leather industry. That's not quite the case anymore. Animal protein demand is up. The drop is actually going down because many of those products are now being sold. Heads and feet and tails and other things are choice. Esophagus, trachea. You go into China, you see these things packaged in styrofoam packages selling for more than meat sells for in the US. You're also in competition with aquaculture. Aquaculture is using fish meal and fish oil and byproducts as feed. In fact, it's the limiting factor for aquaculture growth, especially salmon. I think the goal for pet feed is going to be to encourage and find as quickly as possible alternative proteins in all their various forms. So what would more sustainable and responsible sourcing look like? It's going to have to be fully legally compliant all along the value chain. So it's not just about traceability, tracking something back to the source. It's about transparency. Traceability is where it came from. Transparency is how it was produced. Fundamental difference. It's about livable incomes throughout the value chain. The value chain is going to be broken if people can't afford to be part of it. That's what we're seeing in cocoa right now. If the average cocoa farmer makes 56 cents a day producing cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire, how much do you expect them to pay labor? Why do you think there's so much child labor? Go figure. Workers need to be treated fairly along the value chain, and animals need to be treated humanely. But I think for pets, there's a there's another really big issue, and that is around seafood, especially for cats. Fish are the only thing that we hunt and gather. Think about it. We don't hunt wild things. Every fish that's caught in the wild is a wild animal. It is wildlife. It is being fed to pets. It's being fed to people too. But we've got to start looking at how that wildlife is being harvested. Can it be more sustainable? Can it be certified? Can it be in improvement projects, fisheries improvement projects, aquaculture improvement projects? Can we shift from wild to aquaculture? Aquaculture is more like livestock. It is actually intentional. It is grown. It is managed. It can be far more efficient. It can have a lot fewer impacts. We don't hunt and gather deer. There aren't big deer roundups, although in some communities it would be great if there were to use for pet food. But we don't do that. Or rabbits. We need to be sourcing seafood from lower trophic levels. Seafood that don't, especially from aquaculture, that don't eat animal protein. More vegetarian-based. And we need to find non-traditional raw materials. I would say especially the two biggest pinch points are fish meal, fish oil substitutes, and tuna blood. If we could get IFF, International Flavor and Fragrances, to come up with a tuna blood substitute that would act as an attractant for cats, cats go crazy over tuna blood. If you could find a way to produce that in another way, that would take huge pressure off. And it would take you out of a fairly controversial system. I think we've also got to figure out how to use the system to change it. Walmart asked me about 5 years ago they said, and I took them at their word that they were being sincere, that they were willing to buy certified product if they didn't have to pay more for it. And so I thought, okay, so let's see if that's even possible. And so I went to talk to the CEOs of 6 of the world's largest trading companies. And what we came up with was, if Walmart would actually, because let me just give a little background. Trading companies make 1.5% to 3% on each trade. So they make money by having several trades using the same money each year. They don't make that much money on each individual trade. Sometimes they make a big boom fall because of prices or whatever. But normally, it's just a straight margin kind of play. They said, if Walmart would give us a contract for 5 years or 10 years, not on price, but just on quality and quantities, then we could use that to walk into a bank and borrow money at 2 to 3% lower rates, and we could make the investments in certification, make the investments in climate adaptation that are going to have to be made to get these supply chains more sustainable going forward. So now we've started to do that. We just negotiated a deal with the world's largest hamburger buyer and 600 ranchers in Paraguay that have their own slaughterhouse, and because of the strength of that 10-year contract from the buyer, those ranchers were able to borrow money to invest in upgrading the slaughterhouse, but also in doubling the intensity of production. That was required as part of that contract. P&G are using long-term contracts. Walmart's using long-term contracts. Everybody's doing this, but they're doing it differently. And the problem is when you do contracts differently, when you use different wording, it sends a different signal to the trader. And it's not suddenly a commodity anymore. So we need to figure out how to use long-term contracts with the same language, with the same way to price discovery mechanism. So we're writing a white paper right now. It'll be available in about 2 months that explores what's the current state of long-term contracts. What's the language that's going to allow, at least as a starting point, the traders to actually begin to make the investment so that they can supply not only the Nestle's, but also the Unilevers and the Krafts and the Mondelez's and all those. We need to have more thought about how we're going to create the new commodity, which incorporates what used to be externalities. I put the slide in here because it just struck me that we also have to focus on the package, not just what's in the package. In the case of aluminum, and I'm just using this example, if aluminum is produced in Brazil, and one of the biggest sources of aluminum is from Brazil and from the Tucuruí Dam, that is from an area that's very flat. It's a rainforest area. In order to get the electricity, they created a big hydro dam. The dam, to reach 21 meters, which is the fall they needed to generate electricity, had to flood a huge area. When you run the numbers, basically, what you find is that every can like this that comes from the aluminum smelted through that dam energy, pardon the pun, is 1/2 square inch of rainforest lost forever. A laptop like this one is 3+ feet. So if you're going to use aluminum, use recycled aluminum. It's no rainforest. And it's 10% the energy of virgin aluminum. So get smart about sourcing. Get smart about where your impacts actually are. So just summing up here now. How to think differently is going to need to be your mantra. So I'm put to you that reputation is actually a commons issue. It's not an issue that any company by itself is going to be able to solve, in the same way that no company is going to make their supply chain better while the rest of them aren't, because every company buys from the same producers on any given day. Sustainability is fundamentally pre-competitive. How you sell your products, the marketing side, that's competitive. The raw material side, that's pre-competitive. Got to focus on results and continuous improvement, not on practices. Today's better practice is tomorrow's norm, and the day after the one we're trying to get rid of. So forget about the practice. Every system can get better. Every system has to get better. But let's keep our eye on what we're actually measuring, what the results are we need, et cetera. The biggest gains on your biggest impacts are not from rewarding the top producers in your supply chain. It's from moving the bottom. That's where the biggest gains are going to be globally. And we've got to figure out mechanisms that allow us to use the market to change it. That's where the long-term contract is so important. Without paying a premium through a long-term contract, you can actually make change happen. And I've seen this. I've just negotiated 10-year deals with 3 different layers of the cocoa industry to invest in replanting cocoa in West Africa, where they're actually paying the producers a salary for 3 years while the new cocoa is growing. That's what that kind of the buyer doesn't do any of this, but they enable all of this to happen. So finally, these are some current food realities that I think we all have to take into account. We have 7.4 billion food experts on the planet, and you're not going to tell them what's true about food because they already know. And if they don't know, they'll ask their friends and family. And that's not you, and it's not the experts. Social media is swamping science at every turn. And I think we've got to figure out how to take back the middle, how to create platforms where we can have discussions about complicated issues. Because these issues are complicated, and there's trade-offs. And reasonable people can disagree. But we can't let the extremes dominate the discussions. They can define the issues and more sharply bring them in focus. But let's not let that be the discussion or the only discussion that's happening. We need to make a distinction between traceability and transparency. There's a lot of talk about just traceability right now. How do we know where this product came from? In a globalized economy, that's important. How things are produced is maybe much more important. And then there's distrust. There's distrust of governments, of globalization, of trade, of experts, of NGOs. There is increasing rise of nationalism just at a point when we need to begin to manage the planet as a planet. We can't do that one company, one country, one producer at a time. Thank you very much. Think about it. Do we have time for questions, or did I go too long? Okay, Q&A. Just shout.
What's your thoughts on the use and the labeling of GMOs?
I think consumers have a right to know what they're consuming. So on labeling part, I don't have any problem with that at all. On the GMOs, I think it's a very complicated issue. Probably 60% of GMOs today are medical, and there's not a question about them at all. Everybody's using them. All the insulin on the planet today is made with GMOs. It's a way to produce a far superior product. About 30% of the GMOs that are registered legally are used to produce food kind of agents that cause better fermentation, et cetera. This is used in French wine, it's used in California wine, it's used in beer, it's used in yogurt, it's used in sauerkraut from Germany, it's used in lots of things. Nobody questions it. So what we're really arguing about is 2 or 3% of the GMOs that are used for field crops. Now, and reasonable people are probably going to disagree about that. I think it is certainly allowed for the cultivation of crops over and over and over again, which have produced resistance to the pesticides that were supposed to be used less, that are now becoming less effective. Like many new technologies, farmers need to learn how to do pesticide rotation the same way they do crop rotation, and use fewer pesticides, not more, and use less toxic pesticides. That's something that everybody needs to learn more quickly. But here's my big issue. I look at that cocoa projection. To replant cocoa in 13 years is not something that's going to be done with conventional breeding. To develop disease-resistant, drought-tolerant varieties of cocoa is going to require marker-assisted breeding. And technically, marker-assisted breeding is a GMO because you're manipulating DNA in a way that didn't occur naturally in nature. Now, it's not a transgenic, but it is technically altered. And so we just have to get a lot more nuanced about what this discussion is that we're having, I think. But definitely on the labeling, absolutely. And I think it ought to be maybe even differentiated between transgenics versus non.
Can you explain transgenic?
That's where you're taking part of the DNA from one organism, a trait, like a drought tolerance, and putting it in other organisms. Or a salt tolerance in rice, so that if it gets flooded by ocean water, it can still grow, that kind of thing. Or because of brackish or salty soils, et cetera. So there are lots of things that would qualify as GMOs that are the only way some of these farmers are going to survive. Now, I think the bigger issue, which is where plant breeding is going to go in the future, is around the CRISPR kinds of technology, the marker-assisted breeding, those kinds of things. Because to take a tree crop and really create a new tree, you're only going to do that by selectively taking from one tree that actually has a trait you want, whether it's disease resistance or drought tolerance, and implanting it in every tree that's planted. That's what that's about. But it's not for me, it's not a question of if genetics, it's a question of which genetics. And different societies are going to be different about that. And I think different conditions are going to prompt different reactions to that too. If people are starving, they're going to look at different technologies. When everything is well and good, it's going to be a bit different answer.
Thank you, Jason, for the presentation. I got a question of one of your earlier slides. You had the success that was happening in the salmon division, and that seemed to be market-led. They realized the worst producer sector as a whole. Can you share how did they move that industry forward so quickly?
So let me just make a few observations, but also this presentation is available to anybody who wants it. So if, I should have mentioned that. There's also background writings that go with it. We'll put it in a PDF so you can't change the slide and claim it was mine, but aside from that, you can all have it. It's just a way to protect all of us, as it were. I think that it's definitely a market-driven strategy. And there are 3 companies that control about 40% of global salmon, and they're the 3 companies that reached out to the others and said, look, we got to fix this problem. Are you in? Would you be willing? If we share our data with you. They hired a facilitator to actually oversee this, a Canadian guy who came from the forest industry and done a similar thing in the forest industry. So he didn't know salmon at all, but he knew how to bring people together, knew how to create a platform where people were safe. And the CEOs were the ones that negotiated this. This wasn't put at middle management, it wasn't put at procurement, it was really the CEOs, and they still meet every year. So they still have quarterly phone calls, and then monthly phone calls happen around different topics with the experts in each of the companies. One company went out of business, one was bought by another one, and 2 others have dropped their commitment to become certified by 2020, but are still part of the group to get better because they just don't think in their conditions they're going to be able to get it, and rather than fail, they'd rather just get better. And so there's a kind of nuance to all this. We're creating a similar group for shrimp. Palm oil and cocoa have asked if the progressive producers in those industries can create similar groups. I think when you're dealing with a minority position, it's going to be a different type of group, and they're going to have to work in different ways to have the influence that the salmon one has had. But it's called the Global Salmon Initiative. If you want to go online, you can see their website, see how they report their data. It's not reported by company, but the whole industry shows how they're improving on these different things, and that's available to anybody that wants to look. We're beginning to think about environmental NGOs haven't been very good about social media. We also haven't been very good about consumption. Based in the US and Europe mostly, we focused a lot on population, but actually the population peak is coming. We can kind of see that. It's more the consumption issue that doesn't have an end in sight. And so we've got to start focusing on that. We're going to be using social media to create a platform around food, and we're going to focus on food waste and illegality because we think those are 2 issues that nobody can be against getting rid of. And from that, we then hope to really launch a discussion around consumption. But that's 5, 10, 15 years down the road. But you've got to lay the groundwork in ways that people feel comfortable and trust, and then you can begin to talk about the harder issues. But somebody's got to start having this discussion because that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
So you kind of just touched on this around the population side of things. So it seems like we're going to have to do more with less, but at what point do we actually have to start considering population control methods, sex education for third world countries, things like that? Have you guys heard any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. I mean, we have, like everybody else, we've actually been talking about this for some time. It's a little difficult when it's a bunch of North Americans and Europeans talking about this to everybody else in the world, when in fact it's our consumption that are driving more of these problems than their population. And so that doesn't mean that their population in the future is not going to be a problem. But if all the curves are right, and they seem to be going in the right direction, in fact there's now some evidence that we might not even get to 9 billion people because of some of the income generation that's happening in some of these parts of the world, we really do think that there's an end in sight on population. And we think that's around 2050, maybe 2040, maybe 2060, whatever. Consumption, there is no end in sight. Because every country that has increases in income increases what they consume. And they increase the impact of what they consume. Or they consume things that have bigger impact to produce. And so that's where we're really wanting to double down our efforts. And that's why we have, as a wildlife conservation group, we have an animal protein division. Think about what that means. I mean, that's just such an anomaly. I mean, we had an ag division, which was also kind of odd, and we had an aquaculture division, which was kind of odd. But if we don't deal with the threats, we can't just build fences around biodiversity anymore. That's not going to work because at the end of the day, if it's feeding a child or cutting a tree, the tree's going to lose every time. So we've got to come up with solutions ahead of time, not kind of after the fact. You can't recreate biodiverse systems that are equal to nature. You can create ecosystems that have ecosystem services, but they're not as rich in biodiversity at all, and they never will be. If you look at aerial photographs of areas around Angkor Wat in Cambodia or the Mayan areas in southern Mexico and Honduras and Guatemala, you can still see where forests were cleared for cultivation because the forests that grew back were simply not as robust as those areas 700, 900 years ago. Time doesn't heal all wounds.
Okay. Hi, Jason. So the term byproduct, or the terms byproducts and feeds, if you will, or meals, if you will, have a pretty negative tone in our industry. Can you talk a little bit about that and your feelings about those terms or those words, and whether you also feel that they're negative?
Do I feel they're negative? I think, well, first of all, as I tried to say, I think a byproduct is defined by the person speaking. So if you talk to somebody from China about what a byproduct is, they're going to think that is a prime cut. And so I really do think that there's some cultural differences here that we need to think about. But for me, I mean, I grew up on a farm. We butcher our own. In those days, you could still on farm butcher a cow or a pig, or many chickens, etc. There was no byproduct. I mean, you used it all. And I think it's not a negative term for me, but I'm an odd person. I'm not like 2 generations older than the people that are having this discussion. Not because I'm literally that old, although I am, but because I grew up in a system. I mean, I grew up on a tiny farm. We lived on less than $1 a day. We didn't have indoor plumbing. Lots of things were very different about my childhood from what people are who are talking today about these issues. I was right in the middle of farming and food production. But I don't know what else you call it. But I do know this, and this is interesting. We negotiated a contract between a leather buyer and a slaughterhouse in Latin America. And because the leather buyer was willing to guarantee a market for 20% of the slaughterhouse agreed to become deforestation free. The power of the drop is huge from a market point of view, from a business point of view. It is still the case that slaughterhouses make money selling things that they would otherwise have to pay for disposal of. So that is the power of the pet food industry. And the marketing is disconnected from that because the consumer is totally disconnected from that. But I would love to see a prohibition of using any human-grade quality food for pet food. To me, that is an anathema. That should never happen. There are too many other places where that's needed.
Follow up on that. Is that meat product or vegetarian product? Human-grade meat product or human-grade vegetarian?
That's a good question, isn't it? So there are people who would argue that feeding corn to cows is food waste. I'm not one of them. I don't think feeding a lower grade fish to a salmon and creating a higher quality product, a higher valued product, as long as you're not using more fish to feed the fish than you're producing. If you're converting it into something that's more marketable, more edible, where it will be eaten more, then I think you should do it. But I'm not necessarily the person you need to be convincing here.
All right. Thank you so much, Jason. We're going to take a break in a minute, so it's fine.
Okay. I'll give you this. Thank you.
All right, wow. Take a deep breath on that one, right? So much to think about, yes, and it's heavy. And as a person in sustainability, I struggle with it a lot, right? So there's the intensity of the emotional connection that we have to some of these issues, and then our role, and then how do we constantly fight this battle every day? And there's so many other priorities, and how do we keep it all moving forward, and what's our responsibility? So I know you're all feeling those things right now, because we're all alive, so that's good. And we're going to help you kind of stretch through that. I learned some amazing things today too, and byproduct is one of those issues that this industry does not want to talk about. And as an organization that talks about sustainability, a lot of people ask us, so what's your stance on byproducts? Like, you got to choose one side or the other. Like, the only option here is you're 100% byproduct or you're 100% sustainable. One of the things Jason talked about was how integrated all of these issues are. You have to think about animal welfare because it's a values issue, right? You have to think about the environment because it's a values issue. If people aren't eating, pets aren't going to be eating. Or, these are all ingrained and intermingling issues together. So I hope that you feel that knowing this information is going to make you a stronger business. If you're sitting here and you know what's coming down the road, then you can equip yourself. You can be ready for that marketplace, right? And you will be the resilient company out of that situation. So we always want to bring this information to you so that you have it and that you can start to make decisions with your company and think about who you're going to be when all of this is happening. So thank you so much for sharing with us, Jason. World Wildlife Fund is doing amazing things. I get to work with them because there's been some action in this industry around this issue and how do we collaborate and how is it pre-competitive. So we've been a part of this kind of working movement for the last 3 years, working with some big brands around this issue. You know, what are we going to do? What's the reputation of the industry? How are we proactive? Who needs to be at the table? All those types of things. So we'll continue to bring good information around that as well.